They mocked you, humiliated you, pushed you to the bottom, but they didn't know they had just crossed the wrong person. A new school, strange faces, eyes that scrutinize you as if you are an alien just landed from another planet. You've been through this enough times for it to become a part of you, but this time, something is different, heavier, colder. Your mom said this was a fresh start, an opportunity for the two of you to escape the past and begin anew in a place where no one knows who you are. But what kind of fresh start can there be for a kid with the last name Wallace? In Lincoln Heights, Missouri, the name Wallace is not just an ordinary surname on a student list. It's a name everyone knows, but no one dares to openly mention. It's a name that makes people whisper when they hear it, that makes eyes become more cautious, that makes polite smiles disappear. Because Marcus Wallace is not an ordinary man. He is a shadow that looms over the city, a figure behind shady deals the police know but can't touch, a true crime boss, someone everyone fears but dares not confront. And Dorian, you're just his son. That's it, but it's more than enough. Dorian stopped, his gaze meeting the person who had spoken. A blond kid slouched in his chair, propping his chin in his hand, mouth curling into a half-smirk, half-challenge. Around him, a group of friends watched, all staring at Dorian as if they had just encountered an outsider who shouldn't be here. Dorian didn't react right away. He simply placed his tray on the table calmly, but in the noisy cafeteria, he could feel the silence spreading around where he stood, as if everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. "Lost, huh?" the blond kid repeated, this time drawing out each word slowly, emphasizing them. Dorian glanced over him. A pale face, a straight nose, perfectly white teeth. The kind of face he had seen countless times in his old schools. The rich kid type. So confident it bordered on arrogance, as if the whole world revolved around them. This was Bryce Tanner. The name was familiar to anyone at Ridgemont High. Bryce was the unofficial king of the school, the only son of the Tanner family, the owners of the largest car dealership chain in Lincoln Heights. He wasn't just rich, he wielded power in the way only kids like him do, the power of someone who has never encountered the word impossible. Bryce didn't need to threaten anyone. He didn't need to do anything. Just a raised eyebrow, a word, a half-smile, and everything would go the way he wanted. Teachers turned a blind eye. Students followed his lead. Anyone who dared defy him paid the price. But what made Bryce even more terrifying wasn't his money or his family's power. It was how he used it. Bryce wasn't just a regular bully. He was smart, ruthless, and liked playing the cat-and-mouse game with his prey. He didn't need to beat someone up right away. He liked to drag it out. He liked watching another kid squirm in fear, in helplessness, feeling like they could do nothing but wait for the next bad thing to happen. And today, Dorian was the one he had chosen to target. But Dorian wasn't prey. He looked straight at Bryce, his dark eyes impassive, then spoke in a calm, steady voice. "I don't think I need a map to find a seat." A few people around them murmured quietly, but Bryce only raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement flickering in his eyes. "Oh, sharp, huh?" He tilted his head slightly, his gaze as if reassessing his prey. "There aren't many new faces around here. You're an exception." Dorian didn't respond, simply picking up his tray of food and sitting down. He didn't need to reply because he knew this conversation wasn't really a conversation. It was a warning. Bryce might not have said it outright, but the meaning behind every word was crystal clear. This is my turf. If you're here, you play by my rules. And one thing was certain. Bryce wasn't going to stop here. Kids like him always needed to prove something to the crowd, which meant Dorian had officially become the target. Lunch passed in a suffocating atmosphere. Dorian didn't say another word, but he could feel the eyes still following him, the whispers constantly buzzing in his ears. He knew he was no longer the unknown new kid. In just one day, the name Dorian Wallace had already made its way onto the list of people everyone would talk about. And Bryce Tanner wasn't going to let this go. Dorian didn't respond, but he knew it didn't matter. For people like Bryce Tanner, the words of their prey are never what they need. What Bryce really wanted was a reaction from him, a frown, a little bit of unease. Some small sign that he had succeeded in making Dorian feel out of place and out of control. But Dorian wasn't the type to be provoked. He picked up his fork and calmly began eating, ignoring Bryce, who was still slouched in his chair, his pale blue eyes gleaming with a dangerous curiosity. Bryce seemed amused by the indifference, but Dorian knew it only made the game more interesting for him. People like Bryce didn't give up easily. The entire cafeteria seemed to hold its breath, watching. Some whispered, a few eyes darted over and quickly turned away. No one wanted to get involved. Dorian had seen this too many times. Bullying in schools like this wasn't just about knocking someone down or yelling in their face. It was more subtle, insidious, and cruel. Bryce wouldn't punch Dorian in the face right away. He wasn't the brute type. He was a strategist, someone who liked controlling his prey until it destroyed itself. He would make Dorian's life miserable, little by little, turning each day at school into a quiet battle, one that Dorian would soon realize he couldn't win by simply ignoring it. And just as Dorian predicted, Bryce began the next day. The first step was the whispers. In just one morning, Dorian heard the murmurs every time he passed through the hallway. "Do you know who he is? He's Marcus Wallace's son. He's probably just like his father." No one said it to his face, but they didn't need to. The rumors slithered into every corner of the school like an invisible disease, spreading faster than anyone could control. Dorian tried not to care, but he couldn't deny one thing. Every eye was now on him. No longer were there the indifferent looks of the first day. Now, when he walked by, there were curious gazes, fearful eyes, and worst of all, contemptuous looks. Bryce didn't need to do anything himself. Just planting an idea was enough, and the rest would unfold on its own. Dorian knew this game. He had seen it before, the way people create an image of someone and force them to live up to that image. He didn't need to do anything wrong, but just having the last name Wallace meant everyone would decide who he was, even before he spoke a word. And that was just the beginning. The second step for Bryce was purposeful harassment. In the morning, Dorian opened his locker. Something wasn't right. He frowned when he saw his books thrown around, papers ripped up, and his water bottle spilled all over everything inside. Dorian took a deep breath, showing no emotion. He closed the locker, grabbed what he needed, and walked away as though nothing had happened. But he knew who had done it. Who else but Bryce Tanner and his friends? Just a test, a way to see how he would react. Dorian didn't react. He had learned something a long time ago. People like Bryce enjoyed it most when their prey lost control. So, he wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. But the third step, that was when things would really begin. At lunchtime, as Dorian was leaving class to head to the cafeteria, a hand suddenly slapped his shoulder from behind. It wasn't a casual pat, it was strong, purposeful, enough for Dorian to feel the clear challenge in it. He turned around. Bryce was standing there, the same smug smile on his face as the first day, but this time with Nick, Kyle, and 2 other guys standing behind him. A group of 4. Dorian didn't show surprise. He looked directly at Bryce, his gaze steady. Bryce smirked, shrugging as if this was just some trivial game. "Oops, didn't see you there." Laughter bubbled up from his friends. A few other students stopped to watch, but no one dared intervene. Dorian kept his breath steady, not showing anger, not showing hesitation. He simply remained silent, and for a moment he saw Bryce blink, a hint of doubt flashing in his eyes. Maybe he had been expecting a stronger reaction, a loss of composure, a punch, a curse. But all he got was complete indifference, and that, it seemed, bothered him more than anything. Bryce shrugged, gave a small laugh, and turned away. "I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot more of each other, Wallace." Dorian had no doubt about that. And he knew, next time, it wouldn't just be a slap on the shoulder or a whisper in the hallway. Next time, Bryce would really make his move. Each day that passes, Dorian feels the invisible pressure, a weight not coming from obvious actions but from the small things, creeping into every moment of the day, persistent like a dull pain that cannot be shaken off. The whispers have become part of the background noise at school. As he walks through the hallway, they follow him like shadows. How long do you think he'll last? Probably just like his dad. His mom ran away, but he'll end up following the same old path. Dorian had heard these things his whole life. People always viewed him through the lens of a past he didn't choose. The stares no longer held simple curiosity. They became judgmental, scrutinizing, filled with deep-seated prejudices nurtured by every whispered word. The mocking comments were no longer just distant rumors. Now, they rang out right in front of him, no longer hiding their intent. Bryce had made sure anyone could say these things, as long as they were at a safe enough distance where they could attack Dorian without facing consequences. He ignored it, just like he always did. But there was one person who didn't let go easily. Bryce. People like Bryce never know when enough is enough. He had seen how Dorian ignored his games, how he remained calm, refusing to react despite being provoked continuously. To Bryce, that wasn't strength. It was a subtle challenge. He needed a response. He wanted to see Dorian lose control, to see him go crazy and act just like everyone expected from the child of a criminal: violence, lack of restraint, instinctual behavior. And when his psychological game didn't work, he started using a more familiar method: public humiliation. That day, Dorian walked into math class. The teacher hadn't arrived, and the room was filled with loud chatter, meaningless laughter. He chose a seat at the back, trying not to attract attention. But as soon as he set his books down, a voice rang out, loud enough to make the other conversations gradually fade. "I heard your dad went to jail for stabbing someone. Is that true, Wallace?" Dorian looked up. Bryce was standing by the teacher's desk, his eyes locked on Dorian, a smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. A few students giggled. Some others fell silent, waiting for Dorian's response. Dorian knew this was a trap. If he reacted, Bryce won. If he stayed silent, he still lost, because everyone would think he couldn't deny that truth. Dorian didn't change his expression, but inside, a surge of anger boiled up. His mom had done everything to escape that past. She had chosen another path, another life. But to people like Bryce, he would always be bound to the actions of his father. Without answering, Dorian turned to his book, ignoring his presence. But Bryce didn't give up easily. He walked closer to Dorian's desk, leaned down, his voice lowered but still loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're not going to answer? Or are you just like him, a coward who plays dirty and then runs away?" The class murmured softly. A few kids chuckled. Dorian clenched his pen tightly, his palm gripping it so hard his knuckles turned white. He wanted to stand up right now, wanted to punch that smirk off Bryce's face, to make him shut up forever. but he couldn't. He knew that if he hit Bryce, he would become exactly what Bryce was trying to force him to be. "What's going on here?" The teacher's voice rang out from the door, cutting through the tense atmosphere. Bryce immediately straightened up, turning to flash an innocent smile. "Nothing, ma'am. We were just talking." The teacher gave Bryce a quick glance, then looked at Dorian. A brief moment, enough for Dorian to realize she knew what was going on, but like everyone else, she wouldn't intervene. He didn't expect anything else. The petty games continued day after day. No punches, no public violence, just words, mocking laughter and condescending glances. "Don't make him mad, he might stab you." "I heard kids like him never get rid of their old blood. You think he'll follow in his dad's footsteps?" These things were never said in front of teachers, never had any clear evidence, but they kept going, over and over, bit by bit, wearing away Dorian's patience. The lessons his mom and uncle had taught him echoed in his mind every day. It doesn't matter what people think you are. What matters is that you know who you are. They will do everything they can to make you lose control. You have to be stronger than that. But how long could he stay calm? He knew Bryce had no intention of stopping here. The psychological games were just the beginning. Sooner or later, he would want more. He wanted to see Dorian fall, and Dorian could feel it. The moment was getting closer. The sound was deafening as Dorian's back slammed into the metal locker. The pain ran down his spine, but he didn't flinch. He showed no reaction at all. He knew this was coming. Dorian turned around, his eyes meeting Bryce's fake smile, a smile that didn't bother hiding its intentions. "Oops, didn't see you there." He said it with a light tone, as if he'd accidentally bumped into someone on the street, not purposely shoved someone into a locker in front of an entire hallway full of students. Soft laughter spread around, a few people nudging each other, others whispering, enjoying the scene. Dorian didn't need to look to know that all eyes were on him. He calmly closed the locker, adjusted the straps of his backpack, and walked away as if nothing had happened. No reaction, no anger. But Bryce didn't need Dorian to react. He just needed the whole school to see what he could do to Dorian without any resistance. Bryce understood the nature of power. It wasn't in fists or kicks, it was in the ability to control others. And he'd been doing that his whole life. He was a master at making others feel trapped, making them feel they had no way out, that no matter what they did, the outcome was already decided. And he was using that very skill to slowly crush Dorian. If Dorian fought back, he would win, because it would only reinforce what the whole school thought of him. The son of a crime boss can't escape the violence in his blood. If Dorian did nothing, Bryce would still win, because it meant he could do whatever he wanted to Dorian without facing consequences. Not everyone dared challenge Bryce Tanner. But when someone like Dorian appeared, someone Bryce knew could threaten his power, he had to act. He had to crush Dorian from the start. The second time, it happened in the cafeteria. Dorian was carrying his tray to the trash area when a foot suddenly stuck out right in front of him. He saw it, but didn't have time to react. Dorian lost his balance for a split second, but thanks to his reflexes, he bent down, bracing his hand on a nearby table before he could fall. Laughter erupted around him. Bryce sat back in his chair, both hands raised in mock innocence. "Relax, Wallace. It's just a joke." The whole table burst into laughter. Dorian clenched his tray tightly, but then let it go. He walked straight to the trash can, threw his tray away, and left without looking back. Bryce couldn't hide his amusement. "Too easy," one of his friends mumbled, loud enough for Dorian to hear. And Dorian knew. He knew that if he kept letting it slide, Bryce would just push further. The third time, it wasn't a joke anymore. That afternoon, Dorian stayed in the library longer than usual to avoid wandering around the school grounds while Bryce and his friends were still hanging around. He slowly packed his books into his backpack, checking everything before leaving the building. The parking lot was quieter now. A few students were still lingering around, but most had gone home. Dorian wasn't in a hurry. His mom hadn't finished work yet, and he could walk home without worrying too much. But as he passed through the parking area, something slammed into his back. Dorian froze. Liquid spread quickly across the front of his hoodie, dripping onto the ground. He slowly turned around. Bryce stood there, still holding the empty paper cup in his hand. His group of friends surrounded him, some laughing loudly, others whispering among themselves. "I swear I didn't see you there, bro." Bryce's voice rang out with the same familiar mocking tone, but this time there was something else in his eyes. Anticipation. He was waiting for Dorian to react. Dorian looked down at his hoodie. Soda clung to the fabric, cold and dripping down his arm. Small ice cubes scattered across the ground. The parking lot was silent. The remaining students stood at a distance, but they were all watching. Dorian took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He turned around and kept walking. But before he could take more than 3 steps, a hand slammed into his shoulder, pulling him backward. This time, it wasn't a light shove. This time, Bryce truly wanted to challenge him. Dorian staggered, almost losing his balance. Around him, the laughter ceased. Bryce looked directly into his eyes, no longer hiding the hostility. "What's the matter? You scared?" Dorian felt it right then. He felt the anger rising in his chest. He felt his hand balling into a fist, his fingers instinctively curling. He heard his uncle's voice echoing in his head, "Number, don't let them pull you down. They want you to fight back. They want you to lose control. Don't give them that." But Dorian couldn't move on. He couldn't let it go anymore. Bryce needed to be stopped. And if no one else would do it, he would be the one to do it. The anger was still there, simmering in his chest like a hot coal that couldn't be extinguished. Dorian couldn't forget the laughter in the cafeteria, couldn't forget Bryce's mocking voice, and most of all, he couldn't forget the feeling of being turned into a joke in front of the entire school. But he remained calm. He stuck to his principle. He wouldn't let Bryce win, wouldn't give him the reaction he was craving. And then, the third time happened. It was a cloudy day, the heavy air hanging over the campus as students scattered after class. Dorian left the library later than usual, hoping to avoid Bryce and his group. But as he stepped out into the parking lot, he realized he had made a mistake. Bryce was there, leaning against the hood of his BMW, idly spinning a paper cup in his hand. Next to him were Nick, Kyle, and 2 other guys. Dorian didn't bother remembering their names. The moment Dorian walked past, Bryce threw his soda cup directly at him. The liquid splashed onto Dorian's hoodie, sticking to the fabric like a wet glue, cold against his skin. The group burst into laughter. Dorian stood still, took a deep breath, trying to steady his breathing. He couldn't. He couldn't just walk past as if nothing happened. He couldn't keep ignoring it. He couldn't let Bryce think he could treat him this way without consequences. Dorian turned around. His eyes locked with Bryce's. No more restraint, no more tolerance. Bryce smirked. "I swear I didn't see you there, bro." 1 step forward. "What's wrong? Nothing to say?" He looked around, making sure enough people were watching. "Are you scared? I heard guys like you are all about violence. but now you're running away like a coward." Nick laughed loudly. "Don't say that, Bryce. Maybe he's not a coward. Maybe he's just soft." Kyle slapped Bryce on the back, laughing mockingly. "Yeah, not everyone has the guts to stand up for themselves, right, Wallace?" At that moment, Dorian didn't think about his mother's words, his uncle's, or anyone else's anymore. There was only one thought in his mind. Enough. He slowly removed his backpack from his shoulder, placing it carefully on the ground, as if preparing for something important. The silence spread like a wave, filling the entire parking lot. The smiles on Bryce and his friends' faces vanished for a brief moment. But then, Bryce laughed again, a smile full of challenge. "Oh? So you're finally reacting?" Dorian didn't say a word. He just rolled his shoulders, loosening his body. Bryce raised an eyebrow, but he wasn't scared. He'd won too many fights. He was sure he could take down Dorian quickly. He stepped forward, arms raised in defiance. "Come on, I'm waiting. Go ahead, Wallace. Show me who you really are." What he didn't know was that Dorian had been training since he was very young. He didn't know that Dorian had spent years in the boxing gym, learning every punch, every defense, every move. He didn't know that Dorian was a real fighter, and Dorian was about to show him that. Bryce moved forward, but Dorian struck first. A quick fake step to the left, a feint. Bryce bit immediately, his body shifting to the left to block the strike, but the real blow came from the right. An uppercut to the ribs, strong and precise, knocking the breath out of Bryce. He staggered back, eyes wide with shock more than pain. Dorian didn't stop. He pivoted his foot, powering up with his arm, throwing a perfect uppercut. His fist hit Bryce's jaw, snapping his head back, and then he crumpled to the ground. The parking lot was silent. Nick, Kyle, and Bryce's friends stood frozen, unable to believe what had just happened. Dorian took a deep breath, adjusting his soaked hoodie. He looked down at Bryce. He was lying on the ground, groaning, blood dripping from his lower lip, breathing raggedly. Dorian leaned down, staring straight at him. "Are you done?" Bryce didn't answer, just lay there, his eyes still open, but without a trace of confidence left. Dorian looked up, his eyes sweeping over his friends. "Anyone else want to try?" No one moved. Dorian grabbed his backpack, slinging it back over his shoulder. Without saying another word, he turned and walked away from the parking lot. But he knew this story wasn't over, because Bryce Tanner would never accept defeat in front of the whole school. And that meant the real battle hadn't even begun. Dorian stood upright, his deep breaths slowly stabilizing, his eyes locked onto Bryce. The anger had been simmering from the previous incidents, from the shove into the locker, from the trip in the cafeteria, from the malicious whispers spreading through the school. But he had always tried to let it go, always held back, always told himself that not reacting was the wisest choice. Until now. The hoodie was soaked, soda clinging to the fabric, coldness seeping into his skin, like a silent reminder of the restraint he had endured all this time. Laughter echoed around him, eager eyes watching as if this were just a funny play, a harmless entertainment. But Dorian knew that for Bryce, this wasn't just a joke, it wasn't just a way to entertain the crowd. He wanted to control him, wanted to see him lose his cool, wanted to push him into the mold that everyone was expecting. Someone hot-headed, wild, who only knew how to use violence to solve problems. An imperfect replica of the infamous father he had spent his entire life trying to escape. Dorian knew that. He understood the trap Bryce had set, but this time, he didn't care about the consequences anymore. He didn't care about the gossip that would spread through the hallways tomorrow, didn't care about the looks that would follow him, didn't care about how the teachers would pretend not to know what was happening, and continued to ignore it like always. This time, he wouldn't let it slide, wouldn't turn his back and walk away like before, wouldn't pretend it didn't affect him. This time, Bryce Tanner would understand that not everyone was prey he could toy with at will. The air around him seemed to still for a moment, Dorian's breath steady, his heartbeat calm, his body loose like a spring ready to snap. The remaining students on the school grounds had stopped, their curious, eager, and slightly fearful eyes fixated on him. Bryce's friends, Nick, Kyle, and 2 others, still stood behind him, their faces a mix of excitement and confidence, as if they already knew the outcome of this fight, as if they didn't think Dorian had any chance of standing up to the guy in front of him. Dorian took a deep breath, feeling every muscle in his body loosen. He knew that if he struck now, nothing would ever go back to how it was before. But there was one simple truth he couldn't deny. Bryce wouldn't stop unless he was forced to. And if no one else would do it, Dorian would. Slowly, he took off his backpack, carefully placing it on the ground, not rushing, not showing any sign of agitation. The action itself was a silent signal, a wordless declaration that he was ready. No one in the schoolyard took their eyes off him, the looks full of scrutiny, anticipation, eagerness, and a bit of fear mixed into the air. Bryce looked down at Dorian's backpack, then locked eyes with him, a smirk curling on his lips. "Oh? Finally ready to play, huh?" His voice stretched out, purposely emphasizing each word like an invitation, like another trap waiting for Dorian to walk right into it. He took a step forward, standing directly in front of Dorian, leaving no space between them. "Well then, Wallace, do it. Or are you going to run off like every other time?" Without thinking, without waiting for another second, Dorian moved, fast as lightning. Bryce didn't have time to react, no time to back off or raise his hands in defense. A quick step forward made Bryce instinctively lean to the left to avoid the blow, but it was just a feint. As he moved, Dorian lowered his center of gravity, pivoted, and swept his leg into Bryce's calf. Bryce immediately lost his balance, his torso tipping forward from the momentum, and in that instant, Dorian threw a punch straight to his ribs, so precise that it made Bryce's body flinch. But he didn't stop. A left hook to the jaw, the force coming entirely from his arm through the shoulder, the speed and accuracy enough to send Bryce reeling back. He staggered, his legs trying to find purchase on the ground but failing. Then, the final blow, a perfect uppercut, gravity pushing from his heel to his fist, connecting with Bryce's chin. His body jerked back, slamming hard onto the concrete, his breath knocked out of his chest, his head hitting the ground with a dull thud. Absolute silence. Everything around them froze in a moment that felt eternal. No laughter, no chatter, no smug remarks. Only one clear truth. Bryce Tanner was lying there, motionless, eyes wide in shock rather than pain. Dorian stood upright, breathing slowly, his eyes never leaving Bryce. He didn't feel fear, didn't feel regret, just a sense of relief as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He bent down, looked directly at him, and spoke in a steady voice without any emotion. "Are you done?" Bryce didn't answer, lying there, his breath shallow, the arrogant confidence that had always been on his face now gone. Dorian glanced over at his friends, still frozen, mouths agape, none of them moving or daring to say a word. "Anyone else want to try?" Dorian asked, his voice not loud, but in the silence of the parking lot it rang out like a clear declaration. No one moved, no one spoke. Dorian bent down, picked up his backpack and slung it back over his shoulder. Without looking back, without waiting to see Bryce's or anyone's reaction, he turned and walked away. Not quickly, not in a rush, but with each step carrying a certainty, a strength no one could deny. He knew this wasn't over, knew Bryce Tanner would never accept defeat in front of the whole school, knew that the real battle hadn't even started. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today, he had shown everyone the undeniable truth. Dorian Wallace was not prey. The next morning, as Dorian walked into school, he knew everything had changed. He didn't need to look at his phone, didn't need to listen for whispers. He could feel it clearly. The eyes that turned toward him no longer carried the curiosity or wariness they once did. Now, they held a mixture of respect and fear, a silent acknowledgement for the one who had taken down Bryce Tanner in front of so many witnesses. The parking lot yesterday had been a battleground, and Dorian was the undeniable victor. He walked slowly down the hallway, not rushing, not avoiding anyone. The air around him seemed to slow down. Groups of students scattered along the hall, whispers spreading quickly like wildfire. As he passed by, he caught the subtle nods from students who had never glanced at him for more than a second before. A few of the ones who had once mocked him now showed a careful kind of respect, but Dorian didn't care. He knew this acknowledgement was only superficial, just an instinctive reaction from a society where power ruled everything. People respect the strong, but they are also ready to turn their backs at the first sign of weakness. And most importantly, he knew that Bryce wouldn't disappear so easily. When he entered his first class of the day, he immediately noticed Bryce's absence. That didn't surprise him. No one could show up right away after being knocked down in front of the entire school. Bryce Tanner might be arrogant, might be confident, but he wasn't stupid. He knew that if he showed up today, he'd have to face everyone's gaze, the gossip he couldn't control, the reality that he had been completely defeated. But if Dorian knew one thing about Bryce Tanner, it was that he would never let this go. Bryce wasn't the type of person to accept defeat. He might lose a battle, but that didn't mean he'd give up the war. Dorian understood that what had happened in the parking lot was only the beginning. The real battle hadn't even started. At lunchtime, when Dorian entered the cafeteria, everything became even clearer. The cafeteria, usually a loud place filled with laughter and the noise of hundreds of students crammed into a tight space, seemed to quiet for a brief moment as Dorian walked in. The glances directed at him were quickly averted, as if people were afraid of being caught looking. Dorian grabbed his tray and made his way to an empty table. This time, no one tripped him, no one mocked him, no one laughed when he sat down. But he still felt it. The tension in the air. The strange silence from certain groups of students. He realized one thing. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Because even though Bryce wasn't here today, even though no one dared to speak the truth aloud, everyone knew this wasn't over. Dorian ate slowly, his eyes calmly scanning his surroundings. He knew this game. He had seen it many times before. A guy like Bryce couldn't lose quietly. He couldn't let what happened in the parking lot become the story everyone would remember whenever his name came up. Number. He would strike back, not immediately. Not in the reckless way an average bully might, but surely he would return. And when that happened, Dorian had to be ready. That afternoon, when school ended, Dorian stepped out into the parking lot, his breath slow but steady, his eyes scanning every corner. He didn't expect Bryce to show up today, but he didn't rule out the possibility that he might be crazy enough to do so. But the parking lot was almost empty. Some students had already gone home, a few cars rolling out, their tires lightly crunching on the gravel. Dorian scanned the familiar faces of those who had witnessed the fight the day before. No one approached him. No one dared. He knew he had just stepped into a new position in the underground power structure of Ridgemont High. Bryce may have been the ruler, but now Dorian was the one people would be cautious around. He might not want this reputation, might not be seeking this recognition, but the truth was, he had it. And he knew that once you had it, you couldn't go back to being invisible. He had only two choices. One was to continue down this path, becoming someone everyone feared, using his power to maintain his position, to prevent anyone from daring to touch him again. The second was to find another way, a path that didn't rely on his fists, a way to prove that he wasn't just a guy who could fight. He didn't know if the second choice was even possible, but he knew that if Bryce Tanner came back, he wouldn't back down, and that meant he couldn't avoid violence forever. With someone like Bryce, things could only end in one of two ways. One, the loser gets crushed completely. Two, he comes back stronger, more ruthless, more dangerous. And Dorian had a feeling Bryce wouldn't choose the first option. The news of the fight between Dorian and Bryce spread like wildfire. No one knew who told the story first, but in just one night, it had turned into a legend, blown out of proportion with every retelling, as if what had happened in the parking lot wasn't just a fight, but a battle that marked the changing of the entire school. Dorian didn't need to check his phone to know what was going on. The looks he received as he walked through the hallways told him everything. Some eyes showed admiration, as if he had just earned an invisible title that only a few could achieve. Others were filled with fear, avoiding his gaze, walking faster as they passed him. But there were also those who whispered, lips curled in disdain when they mentioned his name, the ones just waiting for an opportunity to label him with the label they had always wanted: thug. Dorian didn't care, but he knew the real fight hadn't ended. Bryce wasn't at school today, but that didn't surprise him. A person like him wouldn't show up immediately to face the consequences. He needed time to gather information, to plan, to find a way to retaliate without making himself look like a loser. He needed to wait until the attention died down, until everyone began thinking it was over, until Dorian let his guard down. But Dorian wouldn't let that happen. He knew one important thing about people like Bryce: they never truly lose. They just fall back, waiting for the right moment to strike again. At lunchtime, when Dorian walked into the cafeteria, the atmosphere was completely different from any other day. There were no mocking laughs as he passed by, no defiant looks from people like Nick or Kyle. For the first time since entering Ridgemont High, he could sit down without feeling like he was surrounded on all sides. But this silence wasn't a relief. It was the calm before the storm. Dorian didn't fool himself. This wasn't a victory. It was just a moment when everyone was adjusting the balance of power in the school. And if he knew anything about Bryce, it was that he wouldn't let things end with just one loss. He had never been someone who enjoyed violence, never wanted power to define who he was. But now, whether he liked it or not, he had become a name that everyone had to mention, a character in a story he hadn't chosen to be a part of. He looked down at the tray in front of him but felt no appetite. That afternoon, when the bell rang for the end of school, Dorian walked out to the parking lot without rushing. He didn't expect an ambush today, but he didn't rule it out. Bryce might be arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. He wouldn't rush at Dorian with fists right away, not after what had happened yesterday. He would play a different game, one where he had more advantages. As Dorian reached the bus, a voice called out from behind, "Hey, Wallace." Dorian turned, his eyes cold. It wasn't Bryce in front of him, but Nick. one of the guys who always followed him. Nick might not be as smart as Bryce, but he knew how to take advantage of an opportunity, and Dorian knew that if he was standing in front of him now, it certainly wasn't a casual conversation. "Bryce wants to see you." Dorian stared at him, saying nothing. "I'm not kidding, he wants to talk, alone." Dorian didn't believe it. Bryce Tanner wasn't the type to talk, but Dorian also knew that refusing right now would just make things drag on longer. If Bryce wanted another confrontation, he was ready. "Where?" Nick smirked. "Behind the football field, right now." Dorian didn't say anything, just turned and walked in the direction Nick had indicated. He didn't feel worried. If Bryce really wanted to fight again, he was ready, but Dorian suspected that this time, Bryce would choose a different strategy, something more subtle, more dangerous. As Dorian neared the open area behind the football field, he immediately saw the trap. Bryce hadn't come alone. He stood in the middle of the field, but around him were at least 6 others, Nick, Kyle, and some others Dorian didn't recognize, but he didn't need to know their names to understand that they weren't here just to watch. Bryce smiled, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. "I guess you showed up. Good, I think we need a more serious conversation." Dorian didn't act surprised. "What are you going to do, Tanner? Need the whole team to deal with something you're too scared to face alone?" Bryce chuckled lightly, but his eyes were cold. "You think you've won, Wallace. Beat me once and think it's over? You don't understand the game." He took a step forward, his voice lower now, but clearer than ever. "I don't just want to beat you, Wallace. I want to teach you a lesson. I want to make sure you'll never forget the day you dared face me." Dorian didn't back down, didn't show any fear, but he knew that this time he was facing something entirely different. It wasn't a fair fight, it wasn't a one-on-one battle. It was a carefully planned beating. He had no way out. He was surrounded, and he knew that the real fight was about to begin. Dorian stood still in the gym, his breath still steady after the final sprint of the day. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and rubber from the floor, the familiar scent of old gyms, where athletes came not only to train their bodies, but also their minds. In front of him, Coach Harrison stood with his arms crossed, his cold gaze fixed on him, but there was no blame or judgment in his eyes, unlike the other teachers. Did that fight change anything? Dorian didn't need to ask what he was referring to. The whole school knew. The fight in the parking lot, the moment Bryce Tanner was taken down, that news spread like wildfire and still echoed through the hallways and corners of Ridgemont High. He looked straight into the coach's eyes, trying to find the right answer. But the truth was, he already knew the answer beforehand. Bryce hasn't changed. The coach nodded, as if that was what he had been expecting. And there will always be another Bryce. Dorian didn't need anyone to tell him this. He had realized it long ago. Bryce wasn't the first person to try and bring him down, and he wouldn't be the last. If it wasn't him, it would be someone else. If not now, then sometime in the future. It was the law of the world he had grown up in. Coach Harrison stayed silent for a few seconds, then suddenly asked a question that made Dorian furrow his brow. "You've got talent. Don't waste it. Have you ever thought about wrestling?" Dorian blinked, completely not expecting that question. "Wrestling? Yes. You have strength, speed, and control over your body, but most importantly, you have discipline. You beat Bryce Tanner because you're not just stronger than him, you're smarter than him. I told the wrestling coach that I'd find someone suitable for him, and I think I found him." Dorian was silent. He didn't hate sports, but Wrestling had never crossed his mind. He'd been boxing since he was young, partly because his uncle had been an amateur fighter, and partly because his mother wanted him to have a way to control the anger inside. Boxing helped him focus, helped him learn restraint, but it had never been a path for him. Why wrestling? Coach Harrison tilted his head, a small smile crossing his face, the kind that only someone who had spent years training students like Dorian could have. Because there's a difference between fighting and combat. You know how to fight, but if you really want to master your strength, you need to learn how to combat. Dorian remained silent. The coach stepped forward, lowering his voice but not losing his seriousness. I've seen too many kids like you, Wallace. They're all strong, fast, full of potential. But most of them go astray because they don't know how to use what they have. I don't want to see you become one of them. Dorian felt a strange wave inside him. He had gotten used to teachers looking at him with suspicion, used to those subtle reminders like behave or don't cause trouble. But Coach Harrison wasn't saying those things. He didn't see Dorian as a problem to be solved. He saw him as a person with value, with choices, with a chance to do something more than just live in the shadow of a fight. I don't need you to answer right now, but if you really want to know how strong you are, come to the gym tomorrow. With that, the coach turned and walked away, leaving Dorian standing there, his mind more chaotic than ever. That evening, Dorian sat on his bed, staring at his uncle's old boxing gloves. The gloves he'd used since he was 8. The ones that had helped him hold himself together during the days when everything around him was falling apart. He thought about Bryce, about how he would come back, about how he would have to face him again. He thought about the coach's words, about the idea that there was another way to use his strength without falling into the spiral of senseless violence. But most of all, he thought about the future. For the first time in a long time, Dorian began to wonder if he could become something more than just a good fighter. And maybe, tomorrow, he would find the answer. The next afternoon, when Dorian stepped into the wrestling team's gym, he immediately realized he was entering a completely different world. There were no condescending looks like in the hallway, no whispers behind his back, no clear division between the powerful and the weak. Here, there were only sweaty bodies, strong moves, heavy breathing, and loud thuds on the mat. This wasn't a place for people who liked to brag, not a place where a name or family background could help someone stand tall. Here, only true strength decided who was stronger. Coach Harrison stood in the middle of the room, his arms crossed, his sharp gaze locked onto Dorian. Finally showed up. Dorian nodded. He didn't need to say anything more. That nod was the answer, the promise that he would step onto the mat and prove himself not just with his fists, but with real strength. Good. Then don't just stand there. Let's get started. The coach signaled for one of the wrestlers to step forward. A guy who was a head taller than Dorian, with bulging biceps, a confident stride, and a sharp gaze. Dorian didn't need to ask his name to know that this was not someone to take lightly. Wallace, meet Ethan, one of the best wrestlers on the team. He'll help you realize how much more you need to learn. Ethan just smirked, nodding at Dorian, neither mocking him nor showing any sign of going easy. Newbie? Fine, get on the mat. Dorian stepped onto the wrestling mat, his legs slowly relaxing, his body lowering its center of gravity by instinct. He could feel his heartbeat speeding up, but it wasn't from fear, it was from excitement. He didn't know how wrestling was different from boxing, but he knew one thing for sure: he would never back down from a fight. As soon as the whistle blew, Ethan lunged at him. Dorian reacted instinctively, moving to the left, but before he could do anything, Ethan had grabbed his shoulder, pulled him down, and slammed him hard onto the mat. The world spun for a brief second. His whole body hit the mat. It didn't hurt, but it was enough to make him realize the difference. This wasn't boxing, not a street fight where speed and power could dominate everything. This was wrestling, a battle of technique, control, and every muscle tightening with precision in every movement. Ethan quickly locked his arm, pinning Dorian's shoulder to the ground, his breathing still steady while Dorian struggled to break free. He twisted his body, pushing with his hips to get Ethan off him, but Ethan only needed a second to adjust his balance, using Dorian's own strength to pin him even harder to the mat. Coach Harrison stood by the sidelines, not intervening, not saying a word. He just stood there, observing, waiting to see what Dorian would do next. Dorian wasn't going to give up that easily. Taking a deep breath, Dorian felt every point of pressure on his body. He couldn't overpower Ethan with sheer strength. He had to use his strength against him to break free. Relaxing his shoulders, Dorian suddenly shifted his weight, not resisting anymore, but instead pushing in the direction Ethan had forced him down. A brief moment, Ethan lost his balance. Dorian seized the opportunity, using his knee as leverage to flip the situation. For a split second, he felt free, felt his strength returning. But Ethan reacted immediately, sliding to the side and pulling Dorian down again before he could capitalize on the advantage. Less than 2 seconds later, Dorian was pinned back to the mat. The whistle blew. Coach Harrison stepped forward, his gaze unchanged. "That's pretty good for your first time." Dorian panted, feeling every muscle in his body stretched. This wasn't like any fight he'd been in before. You have strength, but you need to control it. Here, you don't just learn how to beat your opponent. You learn how to use your opponent's strength to make it work for you. You'll lose many times, be thrown down many times, and feel out of control. But if you can endure that, you'll become a real fighter. Dorian nodded, his breath still not steady, but in his heart he had already made a decision. He wasn't just joining the wrestling team to prove that he wasn't just Marcus Wallace's son. He was joining to prove that true strength didn't lie in defeating others. It lay in controlling himself. And if this was the path that would help him become stronger, someone Bryce Tanner couldn't control, someone no one could look down on, then he would walk it, no matter how long it took. Dorian's back hit the wrestling mat with a force that wasn't light, his body bouncing up from the momentum before crashing down heavily. It didn't hurt, but it was humiliating. Not because he lost, but because he could barely do anything to fight back. Ethan, his opponent in the practice session, wasn't faster than him, wasn't stronger than him, but he understood the sport, knew how to utilize every little movement to control a match. In boxing, Dorian could use fast, strong, and precise punches to overwhelm his opponent. But here, every strike wasn't to attack, but to gain control. And Dorian had none of it. Coach Harrison stood outside the mat, arms crossed, his face expressionless, but his voice rang out clearly. "Get up." Dorian didn't need anyone to remind him, but hearing his voice only strengthened his resolve. He turned over, placed his hands on the mat, planted his feet firmly, and pushed himself up decisively. His breath was heavy, sweat dripping down his temples, but he didn't falter. Again. Ethan shrugged, a faint smile appearing on his lips. "You're tougher than I thought, Wallace." Dorian didn't reply, only raising his hands in a defensive stance, his eyes no longer as naive as before. He understood something important now. This wasn't boxing. This was a completely different game. The second round was quicker. Ethan charged at him, and Dorian instinctively stepped back half a step, but that was the mistake. Wrestling wasn't a fight where he could simply dodge like in boxing. The gap was his enemy. Ethan seized the opportunity, grabbing Dorian's collar and using his own momentum to pull him down. Before Dorian could adjust, Ethan had locked his arm, pinning his shoulder down to the mat. Once again, Dorian was brought down, and once again he couldn't do anything to stop it. Coach Harrison didn't say a word, but Dorian could feel his gaze, the gaze of someone waiting to see if Dorian would truly give up. Dorian clenched his fists, took a deep breath, and stood up. The first practice ended in sweat, defeat, and exhaustion. Dorian sat on the bench, holding a water bottle, his breath slowly stabilizing. He looked around the gym, a space filled with the smell of sweat, the sound of shoes scraping on the mat, the heavy thuds of strong wrestles. This wasn't a stage for people who only knew how to show off strength. This was a battlefield for those who truly understood their own power. Coach Harrison stepped up, standing in front of him. No smile, no encouragement, no pity. You're strong, but raw strength isn't everything. Learn how to control it. Dorian wiped the sweat from his brow and looked him straight in the eye. I will learn. Coach Harrison nodded, his sharp gaze softening slightly. Good, but you'll have to be knocked down many more times before you truly learn that. Dorian wasn't afraid of being knocked down. He had lived his whole life in a world where people waited for him to fail, waited for him to make a mistake so they could label him a failure, the son of a criminal, someone who won't amount to anything. If he let the fear of losing hold him back, he wouldn't have survived to this point. Dorian stood up, tossed the water bottle into the trash, clenched his fist, and got ready for the next practice. In the days that followed, he was beaten repeatedly, pinned to the mat, arms locked down, flipped over when he thought he had the upper hand. Ethan took him down time and again, not going easy on him. But with every defeat, Dorian learned something new. He learned not to rely on raw strength, to use calmness to observe his opponent, to adjust his center of gravity and redirect strength instead of fighting against it. He realized that wrestling wasn't about who was stronger. It was about who controlled the better. Then, one day, when Ethan charged again like always, Dorian didn't step back. Instead of trying to push him off, he used Ethan's own momentum, sidestepped, and pulled him down with his own weight. Ethan lost his balance for a second, and that was all Dorian needed. A perfect spin, a precise move, and for the first time since entering this gym, Ethan was the one lying on the mat, not Dorian. No one clapped, no one gasped. But Dorian didn't need that. He had proven something to himself. Ethan lay there for a second, then burst out laughing, shaking his head in surprise. Nice job, Wallace, but don't think I'll let you do that again. Dorian just smirked. I'm not counting on it. At Ridgemont High, people knew Dorian Wallace as a guy who could fight, but here, he wasn't just learning how to fight anymore. He was learning how to truly fight. And when the day came, when Bryce Tanner came back with his plans, when everyone waited to see if Dorian Wallace could stand firm again, he wouldn't back down. The rumors about Dorian joining the wrestling team spread throughout the school just as quickly as the news of him taking down Bryce Tanner. But unlike last time, this time the looks he received were no longer just fear or wariness. Now, when he walked through the hallways, some whispered to each other, but the words were no longer full of venom. Some who had once mocked him now fell silent when their eyes met his, no longer daring to throw out the same sarcastic comments. And then there were others, people Dorian had never spoken to, hadn't even noticed before, who suddenly came up to chat with him, nodding as they passed by, as if he'd become a part of a world that once had no place for him. No longer the son of a crime boss, no longer the new black kid. Now he was an athlete, a true fighter. But Bryce hadn't disappeared. A week later, he returned to school. Dorian wasn't surprised. He had been expecting this. That morning, when Dorian opened his locker to grab his books, he heard slow footsteps approaching from behind. "Still remember me, Wallace?" He didn't need to turn around to know whose voice it was. Bryce Tanner stood there as if he'd never left, as if the humiliating loss in the parking lot had never happened. He still wore his familiar smug smile, but his eyes no longer held the arrogance they once did. Something in him had changed. Dorian slowly closed his locker and turned to face Bryce. The hallway was packed with students, but no one spoke. Everyone was watching. Bryce shoved his hands into his pockets and took a step closer, as if testing to see whether Dorian would be afraid. "I heard you're thinking about being an athlete." He laughed derisively, his voice drawn out intentionally so that everyone around could hear. "Funny, but there's a problem." He tilted his head, looking Dorian up and down as if evaluating an item in a store. "You can play sports, but you'll never be one of us." The people around him nodded, some chuckling. These nods weren't just for Bryce. They were for the unspoken belief held by everyone in the school. Dorian understood what he meant. Bryce didn't need to hit him, didn't need to retaliate in a crude way. All he needed to do was remind everyone that there were boundaries that couldn't be crossed, that Dorian might be stronger than him, might have beaten him, might have earned respect on the wrestling team, but would never truly belong in their world. Because no matter what Dorian did, no matter how good he became, how much he proved himself, he would still be an outsider. The people around him, students who had grown up in wealth, in neighborhoods where unspoken rules existed that only the insiders understood, would never accept him as one of their own. Bryce was trying to regain his power. He was trying to tell everyone that the loss in the parking lot hadn't changed anything. But he had forgotten one thing. Dorian had never wanted to be part of his world. He didn't want to enter the world of the rich kids, didn't want to sit at the same table with them in the cafeteria, didn't need the shallow honor that Bryce was trying to protect. Dorian didn't need to be accepted by people like them. He just needed to be himself. He looked straight into Bryce's eyes, his voice steady and clear. "I don't need to be one of you." A pause, just long enough for everyone to feel the tense silence. "I just need to be myself." There was no laughter anymore. No one nodded in agreement with Bryce. And most importantly, no one denied what Dorian had just said. Bryce blinked slightly as if he hadn't expected that response. He had been waiting for a different reaction, maybe anger, maybe confusion, or even an attempt to defend himself. But he hadn't expected that Dorian didn't need to defend himself against him. Because Bryce no longer held power over him, he could yell, threaten, try to appear superior, but the truth remained unchanged. Dorian had won. Not with fists, not with threats, but with his own calm. Bryce no longer controlled the story, and for someone like him, that was the greatest defeat. Dorian didn't wait to see Bryce's reaction. He turned and walked away, leaving a crowd unsure of how to react. And this time, he didn't need to look back to know that Bryce was no longer a threat to him. 1 month later, Dorian stood in the middle of the wrestling mat, his breathing slow, his eyes fixed on the opponent across the mat. He was no longer in the high school parking lot, no longer surrounded by those waiting to see how he would fall. No more condescending looks, mocking smiles, or malicious whispers about the name Wallace. This wasn't a senseless brawl. This was his first real match, where everything was decided by skill, strength, intelligence, and willpower. In the stands, his mother sat there, her hands tightly clasped, but her eyes no longer showed the worry they once had. Across from her, Coach Harrison stood with his arms crossed, nodding slightly when he saw Dorian step onto the mat. And farther away, hidden among the crowd, were familiar faces, those who had once looked down on him, who had hoped to see him fail. But Dorian didn't care about them anymore. Right now, he was focused on one thing: fighting. The referee stood in the center of the mat, signaling for the two wrestlers to step forward. Dorian's opponent was slightly taller, muscular, with a face bearing the confidence of someone who had won many matches before. He shrugged and stretched his arms, but his eyes couldn't hide the scrutiny as he looked Dorian over. He knew Dorian was a rookie, a newcomer to the wrestling world, someone who had never competed in an official match before. Dorian could see the underestimation in his eyes. He didn't let it affect him. He had been underestimated his whole life, labeled with tags he never chose. But if he had learned anything from all that had happened, it was that the truth wasn't in what others said. It was in what he proved by his actions. The whistle blew. Dorian rushed in. He moved faster than his opponent expected. Instead of waiting, instead of probing, he attacked immediately. A low dive, both hands slipping under, locking around his opponent's legs, pulling them sharply backward. His opponent staggered, but he reacted quickly, using one hand to press down on Dorian's shoulder, shifting the weight, pulling him into a lock. But Dorian didn't resist the pull. He used that very force to twist his body, slide to the side, and escape the hold before his opponent could pin him down. Coach Harrison had once told him something that stuck with him. The strongest aren't those with the biggest muscles or the hardest hits. The strongest are the ones who know how to turn a disadvantage into their advantage. Dorian no longer fought by instinct like before. He had learned control. The match lasted for over 3 minutes. 3 minutes that felt like an eternity, each second a battle between technique, strength, and will. His opponent wasn't an easy one to defeat. He attacked relentlessly, trying to push Dorian into a vulnerable position, but every time, Dorian found a way to escape, a way to counter, a way to regain the upper hand. He wasn't just a kid trying to survive in a harsh world anymore. He wasn't the one being pushed into a corner, forced to fight just to prove he wasn't prey. This time, he was a true warrior. And when the match ended, when the referee raised his hand, when the applause rang out from the stands, when Coach Harrison nodded in approval, when his mother smiled with relief in the crowd, Dorian knew he had won something even more important than this match. He had won himself. Bryce Tanner might still be around, still finding ways to protect the small world he believed he controlled. The rumors might still spread, the condescending looks might still appear somewhere in the school hallways. But that didn't matter anymore. Dorian was no longer the new kid, trying to fight against the world. He was no longer Marcus Wallace's son in the way everyone once thought. He was himself, and for the first time in his life he was truly proud of that. Dorian had once been just a name tied to his family's past, once seen as an outsider, once forced into battles he didn't choose. But instead of letting others decide his path, he had stood up, proving his worth by becoming the best version of himself. Victory doesn't just come from punches or fights. True victory is when you can control yourself, when you don't let others define who you are. So what about you? Have you ever been underestimated? Ever had to fight to prove your worth? What path did you take to stand up? Share your story in the comments below. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next inspiring stories. Thank you for watching.